So Rex, why don't you get us started? I think
Okay,
we have a
great.
good gathering
I
here.
will
and
do that.
Still join. So thanks,
I
everybody.
think we have people here, and so I'm going to get us underway and thank our listeners for joining. You've been hearing some of the early conversation that we've got going on. I'm Rex Smith, author of the Upstate American Weekly Report, and I'm also a member of the Adirondack Explorer Board of Directors. And I have to say that the Explorer is really pleased to bring you this conversation, which we really view as part of our growing commitment to climate journalism. Our publisher, Tracy Ormsby, and our editor, Jim Odato, have made a commitment to enhanced coverage of the climate issues that increasingly are apparent in the Adirondacks. And you see that in the pages of the magazine and on AdirondacKexplorer.org. So to that end, we're here today with Dr. Kurt Steger, a noted climate scientist who is a Paul Smith College professor. And we will be focusing on a paper that he recently published on how climate change is affecting the Adirondacks and how it will apparently in the future. His co-authors in the study, by the way, were Brendan Wiltsey and Skylar Murphy. And it was a telling report. The study highlighted a shift to earlier seasonal plant and wildlife behavior. It pointed to shrinking ice coverage and, in fact, a potentially bleak trajectory for Adirondack winters. There's a lot more to understand, of course, and to lead this conversation for that purpose, we turn to Adirondack Explorer reporter Zachary Matson, who is our specialist on water issues. Zachary recently reported on Dr. Steger's paper, and you can read that on our website, AdirondacKexplorer.org, as I said. So I thank you for joining us for what's sure to be an important conversation. And now let's hear what Zach and Kurt have to tell us.
Thanks, Rex, and thanks, Dr. Steger, for joining, and thanks to all the listeners here. So, yes, it was an interesting and important study that Dr. Steger and his colleagues put out, and I'll get right into it with some questions here. And I think a good place to start is actually with how you all concluded the paper, Kurt, and you put it this way: most Adirondack species will probably continue to exist farther north as temperatures continue to rise, but the endemic place-based cultures of local human residents are not so mobile. As longstanding traditions associated with cold, snowy winters fade into the past, the cultural ecology of human residents of the Adirondacks may well face the greatest existential challenges of all in a warming future. But talk about what you meant by that, Dr. Steger.
Yeah, I was expressing my emotions that really struck me as I was concluding the study. And part of it wasn't from the data that we had collected on the campus about the animals, the plants, the lake, the ice. It was from one of the papers we cited near the end, talking about the economic and cultural effects of losing winter. And it was from a study last year, Scott et al. Did it, where they made the list of 21 cities around the world who had hosted Winter Olympic Games in the past, looked at the climate model projections for each of those cities for this century and for the next 50 years, and then by the end of the century. And they concluded that if we go down the extreme emissions path, which today's UN report confirmed we're pretty much on right now, by 2050-ish, only 4 of those cities will still have winter conditions that are suitably reliable for a large-scale Winter Olympics type of event. Fortunately for us, we're one of those 4 out of the 21. But by the end of the century, we're out of the picture too. The only one left is Sapporo, Japan. And it just hit me that this is not just, a compilation of 30 years of observations and records from weather stations. This is my home. And I came here originally in 1980 because of the Winter Olympics. So I have this personal connection to this winter stuff. And in talking to people over the years, I've come to realize, as other folks do too, that where we live helps determine who we are and what our culture is. And winter is the season that defines the Adirondacks most clearly. So I spent some time down south. I live down south. The Blue Ridge Mountains are beautiful, right? We're headed for being more like the Blue Ridge kind of a climate, probably sometime next century. And you know, you can kind of say, well, the Blue Ridge is pretty. I mean, people go out there as tourists, and the folks who live down there love it. But it's not the Adirondacks. It's winter that makes us what we are. And here I am talking in Saranac Lake here, where my wife and I live. We've got more than 100 years of the Winter Carnival with the Ice Palace. We have the Winter Olympic, 2 Winter Olympics. We're going to have the World University Games in Lake Placid in a few months. We've got the snowmobiling Mecca in Old Forge. And so the more I thought about it, it's like, this is going to affect a place that I know and love as it is. And so it has special meaning to be talking about these things, not as an abstraction, but as a here and now issue.
Right. Sorry, I forgot to mention this, but if you have any questions, audience, put them in the Q&A, and we'll start to pick those up as soon as they start to show up. So drilling into this, Dr. Steger, explain to me sort of what this sort of decline in winter could actually look like practically over a 20-year time scale, a 50-year time scale, and then, you know, even longer time scales like 100 or 200 years, you know, what those declines over a longer time frame might look like.
Yeah. So this is long-term trends. One of the things that is also typical of the Adirondacks, of course, and all of us know this who live here, right? That it changes from year to year, right? And you're going to have like a wicked cold winter, and then in the middle of it, there's a big thaw. Or this year, there wasn't that much deep cold, but then the next year there is. So we're still going to have that. In fact, the winter I first came here, 1980, for the Winter Olympics, I came and worked on the bobsled run at Mount Van Hovenberg to help make the ice, and the next day it all melted just before the Olympics, you know. So that's the Adirondacks for you. It's always kind of iffy, but we're talking the average trend. So 20 years, you probably couldn't reliably say what that is, but the projections I would put, which are consistent with what the UN said, comes from a study I did with Mary Thill in the Nature Conservancy about 10 years ago about climate change in the Champlain Basin. We ran 16 global climate models that had been downscaled to the level of the Adirondack Champlain area. And they all had their different perspectives of what the future holds. And we based our study on those. And so in the paper, we do a range of outcomes depending on how much fossil fuel emissions we release. One was the moderate scenario, we called it B1, and one was the extreme where we go ahead and keep burning as much as we can. I'm not even going to bother with the moderate one because we're on the extreme one. So I'm going to look at my chart right here from the paper. Basically what we've got now, if you map out the seasons and the temperatures, this is in figure number 5 in the paper. We've got summer lasting 4.5 to 5 months on average. And if you define winter as when the average temperature is at or below freezing, our winters average about 4 months right now as we're talking. By the end of the century, these models put an approximate shrinkage for winter from about 4 months on average to about 2.5 months on average. So it's basically cutting the length in half, but more, maybe more importantly, is, of course, it's not only shorter, but it's milder. So now we've got a few months of midwinter. The average is in the teens and 20s if you average it, taking out the highs and lows. In that scenario, by the end of this century, which is what, 80 years from now, we've got about half as long, maybe a little more than half as long. And the average temperatures in the deepest cold of that season, which is only going to be about a month long, will be in the high 20s. So that's just below the freezing point. And if you think in terms of the winter sports industry and the winter ecology, we don't have massive snowpacks like you do out west in the Rockies. We don't have the big moisture source. So the reason we have a snowpack is because of the consistent cold. Well, when you get into this shorter, milder winter scenario by the end of the century, you know, you're going to have thaws every once in a while too, on that average. And so it'll wipe out some of the accumulation of the snow. So I can actually see then in that scenario why this other study concluded that under this scenario, within about 80 years, you will not have enough reliable snowpack for a major sporting event.
And you see, and what you thought the UN report said today is that we're on that more aggressive trajectory.
Yeah, so we're certainly on that. There is a glimmer of less dark news on that, because this extreme path that the UN is assuming and that our models were suggesting is actually lower than what some of the real extremes were. So among the climate science community, there's actually a little bit of a sigh of relief that it's probably not going to be as really horrible as we were afraid it might be. But it's definitely serious, and it's because of our choices to keep burning fossil fuels, for which there are plenty of other reasons to cut back from, economic and political and all sorts of things.
So you really dug into sort of that this is going to have deeply a cultural impact on the
Yeah.
people who live in these areas. I mean, what types of things are going to change for communities and cultures, and what questions should we be asking now and talking through now to prepare us for that future?
Yeah. So I'm more of the climate science guy than the climate solutions guy. So I'm going to be just speculating about this as a resident. And I think we Adirondack residents are pretty much, you know, the experts of what this is going to mean for us. You know, we all have our awareness of a particular part of the woods or an economic thing or a town or whatever. So when I think about it, I'm thinking, okay, it's global climate change. It's not just the Adirondacks, right? So summers are going to be getting longer and hotter. We'll get at least an extra month of summer in that scenario, and maybe 10 degrees Fahrenheit warmer on average. Okay, that's us. Well, imagine you're down in New York City, right? The summers will be way hotter and more unpleasant, right? In cities. So people are going to want to come to cooler, nicer places, right? So I see that as climate refugees, not in the sense of people coming with their suitcases in their hands, but wealthy people coming in saying, I want a place in the country, and the Adirondacks are beautiful. So I see more of the gentrification problem happening. And also in the American Southwest, we've already been seeing the effects. This is all expected by the climate models to have it be hotter and drier in the Southwest. And as the cities become more and more untenable with the water shortages that they're going to be seeing, again, people are going to be saying, I don't want to be, you know, in that situation. I want to go to somewhere green that has lakes and stuff. So I think we should be preparing for that. A more sustained influx of people from other places, either seasonally, like in the summer thing, or just in general to get away from that stuff. So we're going to need to face like housing shortages that's affordable for local folks. We're already facing that. We need to really take that seriously. And another thing I can just think of in my cynical self is I think it's really important to look ahead, see that other folks with influence and resources are probably going to be seeing this trend also. And I think there's going to be temptation to remove the protections of the Adirondack Park in the future. Fortunately, we've got the Constitution of the state protecting us, but it's not an invulnerable wall. I think there could be efforts, and seeing how, what people are capable of believing and wanting to do nowadays, I think we should be not complacent about the very existence of the park, because think of how much money these lands are going to be worth when they're already desirable, but it's going to be even more so. So I think anything we can do to boost our resilience, make it affordable for local folks to live here, and be exceptionally vigilant of the protections we've already got for this place.
Right. Well, that's certainly something to chew on for all of us. I mean, sort of backing up to the study itself, you said that the study emerged out of a nature journal that you started on campus in 1990, a few years after starting there. Explain that and how that hardened into a more formal study, and then how people around the park can sort of contribute to tracking these types of changes, in their own backyard, maybe.
Yeah. So it was just a nerdy thing. A lot of people do it, actually. People in the area have traditions of watching when the ice thaws in the spring on their local lake, and they have actual contests of this. And so I was collecting some of that stuff, Lake Placid, and actually at the college, Paul Smith's College, there's almost a century of ice out contests, because people are gambling as to when is the ice going to go out this year, because we all have cabin fever, right? So everybody wants to know when spring's coming, but people put money on it. So you put a chair on the ice, watch when it falls through or something. Well, people keep records of it because money's riding on it. So you got to know who put what dates on and when did it go out. And then people want to know what happened in the previous years so they can help predict what's coming. So there are long records of that. So that's an informal cultural thing about ice out contests that then document the changes. Some of them are written on paper. Some of them are like written on the walls of tool sheds and things like that. Other people keep records, like when do my flowers bloom? So we actually use data from a master gardener, Dana Fast, who lives in Lake Clear. And she's always kept records of when all her different plants are in bloom. And so we use some of that. So, or people do when the birds show up and stuff.
Right.
So I was just doing my own. And over time, I realized, gosh, I've got, 10 years of this, so let's keep doing it. So the key is, the only way you know something is changing is if you can compare it to what it was before. So these home-built, place-based kinds of diaries, especially if they're written on paper, so 50 or 100 years from now, someone can read it instead of on some goofy technology that's going to evaporate in a few years. That's how we know things are changing. And it's people on the ground. It's not going to come from some weather station or a satellite. It's going to come from people looking at the world around them. And so I just encourage anybody to just keep a regular record of whatever is your passion. Is it the plants, when the flowers open, when do the bugs bite? When is the peak foliage? When do the birds migrate? When did you see the monarchs coming? When are the turtles sunning themselves on the log of the lake? And keep them and pass them on. It turned out that I think from here on out, it's going to be extra interesting to do this, because it turned out the time period we chose, 1990, or not chose, but just did it, 1990 to 2020, that 30-year section, did not have an intense warming trend during the spring. It just so happened. It was actually in summer and early autumn was the intense warming. So there was not a great shift in the animals and plants in spring, just during that little window that we have the time from. So it's going to change. It is going to pick up. And that's in the models we did. So if you start doing your study now, you'll be capturing that change. All we could do was look at the year-to-year variations. It was this much warmer. Oh yeah, the bees came out earlier. Oh, it was this much cooler. Oh yeah, the flowers opened up that much later. So we documented that they do respond to temperature.
Right.
But spring is going to take off. So now is going to be the most interesting time. You can pass it on to your kids and your grandkids.
Right. So we do have a question here from Leonard Chance, and this is right up my alley as the water reporter. He wants you to talk about what effect this might have on water quality of our lakes, over the next century or so. We talked some about the stratification and the turnover and the effects that warming might be having on that. There's, of course, cyanobacteria and these harmful algal blooms. Leonard is asking about browning of Adirondack lakes. So talk some about what these warming patterns could mean for the water quality of our lakes.
Yeah. So don't let me forget, we'll talk about browning and we'll talk about the algae blooms and stratification. So let me start with the browning. That's already happening. So my main research is both climate change and lake ecology, and the interactions of the two. So one of our studies was documenting the recovery from acid rain from a lot of our lakes here. And that's a great success story of controlling fossil fuel emissions. With great legislation, bipartisan support, and good science, and it shows that it works. So like Bear Pond, for example, near the college, was crystal clear like a swimming pool when I first came here in 1980, and some of you may know that pond or have known it back when it looked like a swimming pool. Well, part of that was because it was acidified. So what we've documented then is, okay, the acidity it's been recovering, but the lake is also turning brown. So it's not as pretty as it was when it was acid sterilized. So this browning thing is happening all across the temperate zone. And it's because it's gotten warmer and wetter. Partly because the acid is going away as well, and it sort of petrified the forest soils in a way. But when it becomes warmer, the decay processes by microbes in forest soil speeds up. And when it also becomes wetter, then the spongy, dark organic matter in the forest floor becomes like a tea bag. And so you're running warm water through a tea bag, you get brown coming out and you drink it as tea. It's the same kind of substances and everything. So it's turning lakes brown all over. And that has ecological effects. It can change how light penetrates and warms or doesn't warm the lake. That can affect oxygen levels. Some of the organic matter can be nutritional for algae or food webs as well. So that's going on. We've got that because it's been getting warmer and wetter. That's going to continue. As far as the algae blooms go, as it's warmer and wetter, you get more runoff from stronger storms, which we are seeing here too. And so the fear is, as you wash more material in from the surroundings of lakes, you're washing in more nutrition for algae, and more troublingly would be cyanobacteria, which are kind of like algae. They're in the plankton and they turn the water funny colors of green, and some of them are toxic. So we call them harmful algae blooms, even though technically they're bacteria rather than algae. So one of the big worries for lakes here, which I would consider to be a research need, is to monitor the surface temperatures of the lakes year round, and also monitor how stable the temperature layering of that warm top layer is. We call it stratification, because the longer and hotter the summer is, the warmer that top layer is going to be, and the longer it lasts into September, let's say. And the longer that lid is on there, the longer the bottom part of the lake, where it's cooler and fish like trout need to hang out, the longer that's isolated from the atmosphere, and the longer it's not being resupplied with oxygen. So the fish that require cold oxygenated conditions depend on that little reservoir there not running out of oxygen. And so some lakes are probably going to lose that ability as we stratify the lakes longer in the year. Summer is bleeding over into September now. That's going to continue. And if you do that, you not only are threatening the trout, which is one issue. Another one is if you keep it like that and it runs out of oxygen, that stimulates nutrition coming out of the sediments on the bottom and fertilizing the lake from inside. And that can trigger those algae blooms as well.
Right. And of course, the trout and streams and stuff, just the hotter those summers get and those more extreme water temperatures rise, the more likely they are to reach their danger thresholds here. We've got a question here from a Mark who I think is wants to talk a little bit about how to communicate these types of things and how to broaden this social conversation out to include more people. What types of things people who are concerned, how can they share this? Things like that. There are, of course, some commenters to our types of stories about, oh, ha ha ha, I'm not going to order my firewood next year or whatever. So how do we have a conversation about these types of issues, do you think, in a maybe more meaningful way, especially given some of these cultural impacts that we're going to have to grapple with?
Yeah. Well, the key to all of this is part of a bigger picture that I often talk about and is in my books or whatever. And I remind everybody that we've become a force of nature. Our species has become a force of nature. When we're so numerous, our technology is so powerful, and we're so interconnected by technology such as this, that we've become a force of nature powerful enough to change the climate and drive species to extinction and things like that. That's what happens inadvertently. If we can become self-aware of this and become a force of nature that's aware of itself, then we can turn a lot of this around. And you do that by communicating with people, by interacting with people. That's what makes us a force of nature. And that's something that our culture has been pretty poor at, partly because of COVID, but even before that, it's this polarization and demonization of our fellow Adirondackers and our fellow Americans, our fellow Earthlings. It's terrible. So there are ways to do it. I mean, just be civil, be humble, listen to people when they talk instead of doing a shouting match, and just start talking about things we all care about. Even the most hardcore climate denier types I've spoken to, they love the natural world. They love their grandkids. They want a better world. So let's start with that, and talk about what we're seeing happening around here. And that's what I'm hoping this paper does, because you can sort of have your own perceptions of what might be going on, but if you don't have the data, you don't know if you're just sort of fantasizing it or not. So what I hope to do with this was get that started and give us some common ground. But if you just talk to folks, especially folks you don't think you would normally agree with, you'd probably be surprised. Like just having lunch at the college, I've had lunch with, students, faculty, staff, visitors of all political stripes. And if you're just sitting down having a meal together and talking about normal stuff, suddenly something comes up. And for example, some of the, non-Al Gore loving people at the table were saying, hey, by the way, you notice how the rut is coming later in the fall with the deer? Yeah. Maybe we should talk to the DEC about changing when the hunting season is. Well, these are people that you would never want to talk about global warming to, but they're seeing the changes. Or the ice. You used to be able to go ice fishing on this lake and you can't do it anymore. Or it used to be safe to take your snowmobile across. So if we talk, we can figure out what's going on here and what we can do about it, because it's going to change. We are the ones who are best equipped to deal with it in an intelligent way.
Right. But Bob Meyer asked, how do we get people to understand the difference between weather and climate?
Oh yeah, that's a good one. There's so many great little things you can use for that. One is, go to Google and Google something, maybe Google Images or whatever, and just say difference between weather and climate. There's some really creative ones. One is an aerial shot of somebody walking along the beach with their dog, and their trails of footprints behind them are different because the person's walking straight and the dog is zigzagging all around. And it said, okay, the dog's footprint is weather and your footprints are climate, going straight versus ups and downs, ups and downs. The way I usually say it would be, imagine you're in the Champlain Valley and you're coming up to the Adirondacks, Tri-Lakes region, and you're driving uphill most of the way. That's climate, that's the trend. But the ups and downs in the road are weather. So weather is short-term local stuff, climate is long-term. And actually climate trends are easier to predict long-term than weather. It's always, the weather's a toss of the dice more compared to the climate stuff.
Right. So talk about some of the other changes that you guys studied. It wasn't just about ice and winter. There's a lot in there about what we could be seeing in terms of, spring, when plants emerge, when animals emerge, in these ecological mismatches.
Yeah. So as I was hinting, over the long term, the warming is clear. It's pretty much year round over the last century, let's say, and we're warming faster than the global average, which is not a surprise based on where we are in the world. But for the last 30 years, we're getting closer to what weather would be like, and it fluctuates, and different months are doing different things. So coincidentally, our spring observations happened in a time period when the spring part of the year was not changing that much. We don't have the trends in there. But what we did find was that in the actual year-to-year stuff, the animals and plants absolutely do respond. So when it's a warmer winter, the ground thaws earlier in the spring. And in those warmer winters, we find the spotted salamanders will migrate earlier when they come out at night and cross the roads to get to their breeding pools in the woods. The native bees who live in burrows in the ground, their own little burrows, they emerge earlier because the ground has thawed. The spring wildflowers, like the spring beauties, trout lilies, will start popping up earlier. And then, of course, if it's a milder spring as well, then the red maples start to bloom earlier. The pussy willows start to bloom earlier. So we know that the sensitivity is there. So the concern is when spring finally kicks in to go along with summer and fall, the animals and plants are going to change when they do what they do. And that process is called phenology, P-H-E-N, phenology. It's basically the seasonal response of animals, plants, or people to the seasons. So things will start happening earlier. The concern then among ecologists is that, okay, that may not necessarily be all that bad a thing. So what if you come out a week or two earlier? Well, the problem is the species don't live in isolation and they interact. Like, for example, the red maples and the pussy willows are blooming with their pollen on them, hoping, you could say, for some pollinator to come and help carry their pollen around for them. Well, the pollinators would be the bees. If you don't respond to that temperature the same way, one species could shift earlier than the other one due to the same warming. And we're finding that the trees have been responding more extremely than the bees, let's say. So the concern then is if there's a narrow window of time, like for example, the bees have they only live a short time when they come out, they collect pollen, they reproduce and they die. So they've only got 2 or 3 weeks that overlaps with when the pollen is available. If you shift them differently, you're separating them. The overlap starts to shrink. And there may be, well, you might lose a week of that overlap time by the end of this century is what it looks like from models and from our results. If that happens, the bees just lost half of the time they have to do their pollinating. So that's called an ecological mismatch. So we have not seen that happen yet because there has not been a trend in the spring. But that's something, again, where nature diaries would do a lot to document and help us see what is actually happening, if that's going to be going on. And the other one we were thinking of was in the spring, you've got the spring wildflowers that come out before the leaves are on the trees that shade them out. And again, the wildflowers don't respond as much as the trees do. So again, this overlap of time when the wildflowers have plenty of sunlight will be shrinking as well if that happens. So these are called mismatches that could be of concern here.
Yeah. You talked about acid rain, and in our, just to plug our next issue coming out in a couple of days here, I wrote a story about the history of the Adirondack Lakes Survey Corporation and the story of sort of that recovery from acid rain and the pivot that scientists and others are now interested in making towards some more climate change focused questions. But what do you see as, from your study or other things, what are some of the key research questions that you think, scientists should be thinking about now and in the coming years and decades as it relates to climate change in the Adirondacks?
Yeah, so the climate stuff, you just measure it with thermometers. We've got half a dozen excellent weather stations that are ongoing. So we don't need that as much. That's already pretty well covered. What we need is the responses. So we need to be watching the lakes, because you can predict as it gets warmer, we're going to have this stratification extending, which lakes are going to start losing their oxygen. So you do that. A lake scientist goes out and you lower a probe and you measure how much oxygen's down below. And you can watch, if that's shrinking, we know there's major problems, right? So, and you can be getting ready for harmful algae blooms. Basically, then you got to decide, how do we control the pollutants that are going in? And of course, we need to do that anyway. But it's basically going to amplify these problems we've already got. So unfortunately, these kinds of studies tend to be done by human beings who don't like cold weather, or are government funded, and whatever the protocol was for designing the study didn't take into account that you got to be flexible when you do your sampling. So some of these studies happen in the summer of measuring that stuff, but then they stop and they don't show when the stratification breaks down. Like that should be coming later in the year, at some point. And so I think that's one of the research questions. We need careful monitoring all the way from ice out to freeze up of what the temperature and oxygen conditions are in the lakes, because that's going to affect water quality. And you might as well do it all year round, because you can have algae blooms under the ice too. So that's one of the research questions. Another one is, I think the long-term monitoring of any animals, plants, especially the insects, the long-term monitoring of how they're doing. And some people are doing it. We're still doing it at Paul Smith's, the Huntington Wildlife Forest, Adirondack Ecological Center people are doing it, and people like Dana Fast are doing theirs. I would encourage more and more people. We can do it in the public schools locally. You can build that into just nature study stuff in a high school to illustrate what you're teaching about the sciences anyway. I mean, why just read a book or look at a website about flowers when you got them growing outside the building? And document them and then keep the data. And that's what we do at Paul Smith College with the introductory bio kids. I shouldn't say kids, I'm sorry, students. We monitor the plankton in the lake as part of learning what microbes are, and we keep the data and we measure the temperature. We've got 30 years of data, and it shows the lake is warming, just like we were afraid of.
Right. And Leonard is sort of building on this and asking about, that if everyone started doing this tomorrow and stuff, I mean, is there anything to compile these or organize these, or, and there is a lot of citizen science, and some of it is, collated and organized, and some of it I think is isolated from broader discussions.
Well, the key is to have it live beyond you and to disseminate it. And there are two ways to do it. It's actually so entertaining that the second way was brought to me by a young fella. I think he was probably like middle school aged at most, at a talk I gave about climate. And I said this about, you got to put the stuff on paper, because the technology is changing too much. I mean, imagine if I had all those data on a floppy disk, there's nothing to read it, right? And I gave the example of a friend, Valerie White from Canton, who bought a property, went up in the attic, and there was a stack of papers from a former owner with decades of nature and weather observations out at Cranberry Lake. And if that had been electronic technology, it would have gone in the trash. But this young fellow spoke up then and said, no, you need both. You need electronic too, because with electronic, you can disseminate it all over the world. And he's right. So we need both. But even if you just do it for a few years, just pick a spot, pick the species right when they're doing what they're doing, and then keep the data, pass it on to other folks. And then folks like me later on will be collecting it sometime, as long as it still exists, either because it's in paper and it persists, or because it was scattered so widely that you can find it.
Right. It's interesting. So I'll wrap. I mean, a lot of our comments on the story and some questions that were submitted ahead of time, came from readers sort of recounting the harsher winters of their childhood, in the 70s or whatever, remembering, roads covered in snow and long lasting deep snowpack and colder temperatures and winter conditions in May and all of this. And one of them asked, so is it just anecdotal or has winter wimped out? So I don't know if you have an opinion of that or not, but
Oh, yeah.
it does sound like it's
absolutely.
maybe not so just anecdotal after all.
No, the weather records show that. But the bigger thing is to look at what the effects of that are. The temperature records can show you. I mean, we got them plotted out there, 100 years of temperatures bouncing up and down. People my age, I'm 66, right? I remember the cold winters when I was a little kid. Oh, the snow was over my head. Well, part of it was because I was a little kid, but part of it was I was a little kid in the 60s and it was unusually cold then. And you can see it in the weather records. But if you superimpose the full story, it's been increasing for a century with ups and downs in it. The 60s were a down. So yes, you may well remember winter being cooler, but even before the 60s, I mean, there were like 30-degree below zero nights, not uncommon at all here. And I don't remember the last time I've seen that. So I think I would leave the weather records to the weather stations. I'd focus on, well, the flowers, the critters, the lake, but also the people. There's a fella in Wilmington who does snow plowing for extra money. He's kept his snow plowing records of how often he is snow plowed over the years, how many times he went out, how much, and this has economic consequences for Wilmington and Saranac Lake and Lake Placid, because when people have the extra money, they spend it locally. And so that has, our cultural ecology, that's basically economics, right? It's ecology of humans. That's important too. And that's going to be part of the cultural change. What are people like him going to do as the winters get less and less profitable? You got to think of something else to do.
Right. So awesome. Well, I'm going to wrap it up here with maybe a couple of thoughts. Again, thanks to Dr. Steger for joining and sharing this important research. And thanks to all, the panelists, I think, are still hanging around. Or, sorry, the attendees are still here with us. So maybe they would be happy to listen to you talk for another 45 minutes or an hour, but we'll wrap this up. I mean, I think it's important for us to all focus on the cultural impacts that Dr. Steger is highlighting here and how this change in conditions is going to affect that. I think we'll need to pay attention to the water quality and these dynamics of temperatures and stratification and turnover and oxygenation, the ecological mismatches that might be emerging between different animals and species and plants as their patterns change, and something that I hadn't thought a lot about. I've given some thought to this idea of climate refugees, and as other places might be seeing even more dire consequences, the lack of water, drought, places become literally uninhabitable in times throughout the year, that the Adirondacks might become, a more shining, desirable location. And that if that happens, and as that happens, what does that mean for our protections that everyone, values here so much? So it does sound like there might be longer paddling seasons, though. I don't know, but yeah. There you go. So anyway, well, thanks again to everybody for joining. And I think we hope to do more of these types of events on this topic and others in the future. So thanks again to everybody, and we'll wrap it up there. Thanks again. Thanks very much, Dr. Steger. I appreciate your time.
Thanks, everybody.
And thanks, Rex. Thanks.